Weeks passed, and the wait for Juilliard's decision felt like an eternity. Emily threw herself into her routine, working long hours at the restaurant, practicing late into the night, and trying to keep her hopes in check. She told herself not to get too excited. After all, she was competing against people who had spent their entire lives preparing for this opportunity. Still, there were moments when she allowed herself to dream, imagining what it would feel like to walk through those hallowed halls as a student, to sit in classrooms filled with fellow musicians, to let music take center stage in her life once again. One chilly afternoon, as Emily cleared tables during the lunch rush, her phone buzzed in her pocket. She glanced at the screen mid-step, nearly dropping the tray she was carrying. It was an email from Juilliard. Her breath caught in her throat, and for a moment, she simply stood frozen, staring at the notification. The restaurant buzzed around her, oblivious to the storm of emotions raging inside her chest. "Emily," one of her coworkers called out, snapping her back to reality. "You okay?" She nodded quickly, forcing a smile. "Yeah, I'm fine," she lied, slipping into the staff break room for privacy. With trembling hands, she opened the email and began to read. The words blurred together at first, but then they came into focus. Congratulations, she had been accepted. Not on a full scholarship, but with significant financial aid that made it possible for her to attend. Tears spilled down her cheeks as she reread the message over and over, each word confirming what still felt impossible, that she, Emily Dawson, a waitress who hadn't touched a piano in years, was going to Juilliard. When she finally emerged from the break room, her coworkers immediately back in her tiny apartment later that night, Emily sat on the edge of her worn-out couch, staring at the blank wall, as if it might hold answers to the questions swirling in her mind. The room was quiet except for the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen and the occasional creak of the building settling around her. It was a familiar silence, one she had grown accustomed to during the countless nights spent studying or working late shifts. But tonight, it felt heavier, almost suffocating. Her thoughts raced back to the restaurant, replaying every moment. Elliot's bold challenge, the stunned faces of the patrons, the way the music had flowed out of her like a forgotten language suddenly remembered. She could still hear the applause echoing in her ears, feel the warmth of admiration from strangers who had witnessed something deeply personal. And then there was Elliot's offer, an audition at Juilliard, a chance to step into a world she had once dreamed of but long since abandoned. But with the excitement came doubt, thick and unrelenting. "What if I'm not good enough?" she thought, clutching a pillow tightly against her chest. "It's been years since I played seriously. People train their entire lives for this, and here I am thinking I can just walk in after all this time." The fear of failure loomed large, casting a shadow over the flicker of hope that had ignited inside her. Yet, as much as the doubts weighed her down, another voice whispered softly in the back of her mind. The voice of her younger self, the girl who used to sit at the piano for hours, losing track of time as melodies poured out of her fingertips. That girl had believed in magic, in the power of music to heal and transform. She had dared to dream big, even when life tried to pull her back down to earth. Emily sighed, running a hand through her hair. "Maybe I owe it to her," she murmured aloud, surprising herself with the sound of her own voice breaking the silence. "Maybe I owe it to me." The next morning, she woke up determined to face her fears head-on. She borrowed an old keyboard from a neighbor, a dusty relic missing a few keys, and began practicing whenever she had a spare moment. At first, her fingers stumbled, clumsy and unfamiliar with the motions they had once known so well. But slowly, painstakingly, muscle memory kicked in. Scales became smoother, chords richer, and pieces she hadn't touched in years started coming back to her. Each note felt like reclaiming a piece of herself, stitching together fragments of a life she had thought lost forever. Elliot checked in regularly, offering advice and encouragement. He sent her sheet music, connected her with a renowned pianist for coaching sessions, and even arranged for a rehearsal space where she could practice without distractions. Though his involvement initially made her uncomfortable, She hated the idea of owing someone so much. She eventually came to appreciate his belief in her. It wasn't just about the money or the resources. It was about the way he saw potential in her when she struggled to see it in herself. As the days passed, Emily found herself growing more confident, not just in her ability to play, but in her decision to take this leap of faith. She reminded herself that she didn't have to be perfect. She just had to try. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to imagine what life might look like if things worked out, if she actually got into Juilliard, if she could pursue music as more than just a distant dream. On the morning of the audition, Emily stood in front of the mirror, adjusting the collar of her blouse and smoothing out imaginary wrinkles in her skirt. Her reflection stared back at her, wide-eyed and nervous, but also resolute. She took a deep breath, reminding herself of everything she had overcome to get here. "You've got this," she whispered to herself, forcing a small smile. Whether or not she succeeded today, she knew one thing for certain. She was no longer the same person who had walked into that restaurant weeks ago. She had rediscovered a part of herself she thought she'd lost, and that alone was worth celebrating. The evening buzzed with energy inside an upscale restaurant in the heart of New York City. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling, casting a warm glow over the room. The tables were neatly arranged, each adorned with pristine white tablecloths and sparkling silverware. Patrons dressed in their finest sat chatting, sipping on glasses of expensive wine, and indulging in gourmet dishes that looked almost too beautiful to eat. It was the kind of place where dreams felt possible, yet reality often reminded people of its harshness. At one corner of the room sat Mr. Elliot Grayson, a man who needed no introduction. Known for his sharp suits, sharper tongue, and knack for making headlines, he was the epitome of wealth and confidence. His reputation preceded him. He was bold, unpredictable, and loved being the center of attention. Tonight, however, he dined alone, which was unusual for someone like him. He picked at his meal, occasionally glancing around the room as if searching for something or someone to entertain him. Across the bustling floor, Emily Dawson moved gracefully between tables, balancing trays laden with plates of food. She wore a simple black uniform, her name tag pinned neatly above her chest. Emily wasn't just any waitress. She worked tirelessly to support herself while pursuing a degree in literature. Her dream was to become a writer someday. But for now, life demanded she focus on paying bills and keeping her head above water. Quiet by nature, she preferred blending into the background, avoiding unnecessary attention. Despite her best efforts, though, Emily couldn't escape notice completely. Her kindness stood out. She always greeted customers with a genuine smile, even when they snapped at her or complained about trivial things. Some patrons appreciated her warmth, tipping generously, while others barely acknowledged her presence. Still, Emily remained patient, knowing that every shift brought her one step closer to her goals. As the night wore on, the atmosphere grew livelier. Laughter echoed through the room, mingling with the soft clinking of glasses and cutlery against fine china. Near the entrance stood a grand piano, rarely played except during special events. Its polished surface gleamed under the light, almost begging to be touched. Most evenings, it remained untouched, a silent witness to the restaurant's hustle and bustle. But tonight, it would play a pivotal role in changing lives. Elliot's eyes landed on the piano, and a sly grin spread across his face. Always looking for ways to stir things up, he leaned back in his chair, tapping his fingers rhythmically on the edge of the table. Then, without warning, he raised his hand and beckoned to Emily, who happened to be passing by with an empty tray. Surprised, she approached cautiously, unsure what to expect from the infamous millionaire. "What's your name?" Elliot asked, his tone casual but commanding. "Emily," she replied softly, clutching the tray tighter. "Well, Emily," he continued, leaning forward slightly, "do you happen to know how to play that piano over there?" Emily blinked, caught off guard by the question. "No, sir," she answered quickly, shaking her head. "I'm just here to serve." Elliot chuckled, clearly amused by her response. Are you sure about that? You seem like the type who might have a hidden talent or two. His words carried a teasing edge, drawing curious glances from nearby diners. Sensing the growing interest, Elliot decided to push further. "Tell you what," he said, raising his voice just enough to ensure others could hear. "If you give it a shot, I'll make it worth your while." The room began to quiet down as more guests turned their attention toward the unfolding scene. Whispers rippled through the crowd, some amused by Elliot's antics, others intrigued by the sudden drama. For Emily, the moment felt surreal. All eyes were on her, and the pressure mounted with each passing second. Little did anyone know, this seemingly ordinary evening was about to take a turn none of them would forget. As the evening wore on, the atmosphere in the restaurant shifted from one of astonishment to something warmer, more intimate. The initial shock of Emily's performance had given way to a sense of connection, a shared moment that lingered long after the final notes faded. Patrons who had arrived as strangers now exchanged knowing glances, their conversations peppered with references to what they had just witnessed. Some even approached Emily directly, offering heartfelt compliments, or simply thanking her for sharing her gift. It was clear that her music had touched them in ways she hadn't anticipated. Elliot, however, wasn't content to let the night end there. Still standing near the piano, he watched Emily closely, his mind visibly working through some unspoken idea. After a few moments, he turned to address the room. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, raising his voice just enough to draw everyone's attention. "I think we can all agree that we've been treated to something truly remarkable tonight. But I believe this is only the beginning for Emily." The announcement caught her off guard. She looked up at him, her brow furrowed in confusion. "What do you mean?" she asked cautiously, unsure whether to feel hopeful or wary. Elliot grinned, clearly enjoying the spotlight. "What I mean," he continued, pulling out his phone, "is that talent like yours deserves an audience far bigger than this restaurant. You shouldn't be serving tables. You should be performing on stages." With that, he made a quick call, speaking rapidly into the receiver about arranging an audition at Juilliard, one of the most prestigious music schools in the world. Emily's eyes widened in disbelief. "Juilliard," she repeated, her voice trembling. That's impossible. People train their whole lives to get in there. I haven't played seriously in years." But Elliot wasn't deterred. "Impossible. Maybe for someone else, but not for you. Not after what we just heard." He ended the call and turned back to her, his expression firm yet encouraging. "I set it up. You'll audition next week. And don't worry, I'll cover everything. Travel, preparation, whatever you need. Consider it an investment." The room erupted into murmurs once again, this time filled with excitement and admiration. Several patrons nodded approvingly, while others whispered words of encouragement to Emily. One older man raised his glass in a toast, saying, "To second chances, and to following your dreams, no matter how long it's been." Despite the support surrounding her, Emily felt overwhelmed. Part of her wanted to jump at the opportunity, to seize this lifeline being offered to her, but another part recoiled at the thought of stepping back into a world she'd left behind. What if she failed? What if she couldn't live up to the expectations suddenly placed upon her? The weight of those questions pressed heavily on her chest. "I don't know," she said quietly, shaking her head. "It's too much, too fast." Elliot knelt beside her, his tone softening. "Listen to me, Emily. Life doesn't hand out opportunities like this every day. Trust me, I've seen plenty of people waste their talents because they were afraid to take a risk. Don't be one of them." His words struck a chord deep within her. Emily glanced around the room, meeting the eyes of those who had applauded her earlier. There was kindness in their expressions, a collective belief in her potential that made her heart ache with longing. For so long, she had buried her passion under layers of responsibility and survival. Now, faced with the chance to reclaim it, she realized how desperately she missed the music, the way it used to make her feel alive. "I'll think about it," she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. It wasn't a yes, but it wasn't a no either. Elliot seemed satisfied with that. For now. As the night drew to a close, Emily found herself replaying the events over and over in her mind. The applause, the compliments, the unexpected offer. It all felt surreal, like a dream she was afraid of waking up from. Yet beneath the whirlwind of emotions, a small spark of hope began to grow. Perhaps, just perhaps, this was her chance to rewrite her story, to step out of the shadows and embrace the person she had always dreamed of becoming. As Emily approached the grand piano, her steps felt like they were dragging her toward an unknown fate. The murmurs in the room softened, replaced by a palpable tension that seemed to press against her chest with every step she took. Her heart pounded so loudly she was sure everyone could hear it. She glanced down at her hands, hands that had spent years gripping trays and wiping tables, and wondered how they would possibly find their way across the polished keys of the piano. When she finally reached the instrument, she paused, staring at it as if it were some kind of alien artifact. It looked both familiar and foreign all at once. Memories flashed through her mind. Childhood afternoons spent practicing scales, her mother's proud smile during recitals, the way her fingers used to glide effortlessly over the keys. But those memories felt distant now, like fragments of another life she'd left behind long ago. "Well," Elliot called out from his table, breaking the silence. His voice carried just enough impatience to remind Emily of why she was standing there in the first place. "Are you going to sit or not?" Emily swallowed hard, forcing herself to take a seat on the bench. The leather creaked slightly under her weight, the sound unnaturally loud in the quiet room. She hesitated, her fingers hovering above the keys without touching them. For a moment, she considered backing out entirely, standing up, apologizing, and retreating to the safety of her usual routine. But then she glanced around the room and saw the expectant faces watching her. Some looked amused, others curious, and a few even encouraging. There was no turning back now. Elliot leaned forward, resting his chin on his hand as he watched intently. "Any time now," he said, his tone light, but tinged with mockery. "We're all waiting." Emily closed her eyes for a brief second, trying to steady her breathing. Her palms were damp, and she wiped them discreetly on her skirt before placing her fingers lightly on the keys. She hadn't touched a piano in years, not since life had forced her to set aside her passion for survival. Music had been her escape once, her sanctuary, but somewhere along the way, reality had pushed it aside. Now here she was, about to play in front of strangers who likely expected nothing more than a clumsy attempt at entertainment. Her fingers trembled as she pressed down on the first key. A single note rang out, clear and resonant, cutting through the silence like a knife. The sound startled her. It was richer, fuller than she remembered. Encouraged by the purity of that one note, she tried another, then another, until a simple melody began to emerge. It wasn't perfect. Her timing wavered, and her touch lacked confidence, but it was enough to hold the room's attention. The whispers died down completely, replaced by an almost reverent stillness. Even Elliot sat up straighter, his smirk fading into something closer to genuine interest. Emily didn't notice any of this, though. She was lost in the music, or rather, in the act of rediscovering it. Each note felt like a thread pulling her back to a part of herself she thought she'd lost forever. Then, as if guided by muscle memory, her hands found their rhythm. The hesitant, disjointed notes transformed into something fluid, something breathtaking. Without realizing it, Emily slipped into Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata, a piece she had played countless times as a teenager. The haunting melody filled the room, wrapping itself around everyone present. It was slow and melancholic, yet undeniably beautiful, a bittersweet reminder of dreams deferred and passions buried. For Emily, it was as if the world outside the piano ceased to exist. All the stress, all the exhaustion, all the doubts melted away, leaving only the music. Tears pricked at the corners of her eyes, but she blinked them back, focusing instead on the cascade of notes flowing from her fingertips. She didn't dare look up, afraid of seeing judgment or pity in the faces around her. Instead, she poured everything she had into the performance, letting the music speak for her. By the time the final note faded into silence, the room remained utterly still. No one moved, no one spoke. Even Elliot, who had started this whole thing as a playful dare, sat frozen in his chair, his expression unreadable. For a moment, it felt as though time itself had stopped, suspended in the wake of something extraordinary. And when the applause finally came, slow at first, then building into thunderous cheers, it shattered the spell, bringing Emily crashing back to reality. The day of the audition arrived, and Emily's nerves were stretched taut like violin strings. As she stepped into Juilliard's grand hallways, she felt as though she had entered another world, one where passion for music filled every corner, every note hanging in the air like a promise. The polished floors reflected the soft light streaming through tall windows, and the distant sound of scales and melodies drifted from practice rooms. It was both inspiring and intimidating, a place where dreams were nurtured but also tested. Emily clutched her sheet music tightly, her palms damp despite the cool autumn breeze that had followed her inside. She glanced around at the other candidates waiting nervously in the lobby, some flipping through their scores, others stretching their fingers or quietly humming under their breath. They looked so confident, so prepared. Many of them probably spent years training for this moment, while she had only weeks to shake off the rust and rediscover her skills. Doubts crept back in, whispering cruelly in her ear, "What makes you think you belong here?" But then she remembered Elliot's words, that night in the restaurant when he'd refused to let her shrink away from her talent. She thought about the hours she'd poured into practicing, the blisters on her fingers, the late nights when exhaustion threatened to pull her under, but she kept going anyway. This wasn't just about proving herself to others. It was about honoring the journey she'd taken to get here. Taking a deep breath, she straightened her shoulders and tried to quiet the storm of anxiety brewing within her. When her name was called, Emily walked into the audition room with measured steps, her heart pounding so loudly she feared everyone could hear it. The panel of judges sat behind a long table, their faces impassive as they scribbled notes on clipboards. A grand piano stood center stage, its presence commanding yet comforting. Emily approached it slowly, bowing slightly before taking her seat. Her fingers hovered above the keys, trembling slightly, but she closed her eyes and focused on the rhythm of her breathing. She began with Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata, the same piece she had played in the restaurant. At first her touch was hesitant, each note ringing out cautiously as if testing the waters. But as the melody unfolded, something shifted. The music flowed more freely, carrying with it fragments of emotion she hadn't realized she was holding onto. Longing, resilience, hope. Tears pricked at the corners of her eyes, but she blinked them back, determined not to break her concentration. By the time she reached the final chords, the room was silent, heavy with the weight of what she had shared. For a moment, no one spoke. Then one of the judges, a stern-looking woman with sharp glasses, nodded approvingly. "That was unexpected," she said, her tone softening. "Where did you study?" Emily hesitated, unsure how to answer. I didn't," she admitted quietly. "I used to play when I was younger, but I stopped for a long time. I've only recently started again." The admission hung in the air, and for a brief second, she braced herself for rejection. But instead, another judge leaned forward, his expression thoughtful. "Your technique needs refinement, no question. But there's something raw and authentic in your playing, something that can't be taught. Tell me, why do you want to come back to music now?" Emily swallowed hard, her mind racing for the right words. "Because it's who I am," she said finally, her voice steadier than she expected. "It's always been a part of me, even when I tried to push it aside. Life got in the way, but I don't want to lose it again." The judges exchanged glances, their expressions unreadable. After what felt like an eternity, the head judge thanked her and dismissed her from the room. As Emily walked out, she felt drained but oddly lighter, as though she had laid bare a piece of her soul and left it in their hands. Waiting outside, Elliot greeted her with a hopeful smile. "How did it go?" he asked eagerly. "I'm not sure," Emily replied honestly, shrugging. "I gave it my best shot. That's all I could do." Elliot placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "Sometimes giving your best is enough. Trust me, I've seen greatness when it walks into a room." And tonight, greatness walked in wearing a waitress uniform. His words brought a small, grateful smile to her face. For the first time, Emily allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, she had done enough. Whatever happened next, she knew she had faced her fears and taken a chance on herself, and that alone made her proud. Elliot's challenge hung in the air like a dare no one could ignore. Emily stood frozen, clutching the tray tightly against her chest as if it were some kind of shield. Her heart raced, and she felt the weight of dozens of eyes boring into her from every corner of the room. The once bustling restaurant had grown eerily quiet, save for the faint hum of background music playing softly through hidden speakers. It was as though time itself had slowed down, leaving Emily trapped in this unexpected spotlight. "Well?" Elliot pressed, his lips curling into a smirk that made him look both amused and slightly menacing. He leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms over his tailored suit jacket. "Come on, Emily. Don't tell me you're afraid to try. What's the worst that could happen? You hit a wrong note or two. Big deal." His tone was light, almost playful, but there was an edge to it, a mix of curiosity and condescension that made Emily's cheeks flush red. The murmurs around the room grew louder. A few patrons exchanged knowing glances, whispering behind their hands about whether Emily would take the bait. Some seemed entertained by the spectacle, while others appeared genuinely curious to see what she might do. One older gentleman at a nearby table leaned over to his companion and said, "She doesn't strike me as the type who plays piano. But hey, you never know with these things." Emily hesitated, her mind racing. She wanted nothing more than to politely decline and retreat to the safety of the kitchen, where she could disappear among the clatter of dishes and the comforting rhythm of work. But something stopped her. Maybe it was the way Elliot's words carried a hint of mockery, as though he already assumed she'd back down. Or maybe it was the growing anticipation in the room, the collective curiosity pressing down on her like a heavy blanket. Whatever it was, she found herself unable to simply walk away. I don't think I should," she stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm here to serve, not to perform." Her grip tightened on the tray, knuckles turning white. She glanced toward the grand piano near the entrance, its polished surface gleaming under the soft glow of the chandelier. It looked so elegant, so out of reach, like something from another world entirely. But Elliot wasn't done yet. "Oh, come now," he said, leaning forward again, resting his elbows on the table. His expression shifted slightly, becoming more intense, more persuasive. "Let's make this interesting. If you sit down at that piano and give it your best shot, even if it's just a few notes, I'll give you $500 right here, right now." He reached into his pocket and pulled out his wallet, extracting 5 crisp $100 bills and holding them up for everyone to see. A murmur rippled through the crowd, a mix of surprise and excitement. $500 was no small sum, especially for someone like Emily, who worked long hours just to scrape by. For many of the diners, it was clear this wasn't just about music anymore. It was about courage, about taking a risk when the odds seemed stacked against you. Still, Emily hesitated. "I really don't," she began, only to be interrupted by Elliot once again. "Don't worry," he cut in, his voice smooth and confident. "Nobody expects you to be Mozart. Just give it a try. Worst case scenario, you embarrass yourself for 30 seconds and walk away with enough cash to cover next month's rent. Best case scenario." He trailed off, letting the implication hang in the air. His eyes sparkled with mischief, as if he knew exactly how this would play out. And he relished the thought of watching it unfold. The pressure mounted. Emily could feel the eyes of the entire room on her, waiting, wondering what she would do. Even the waitstaff paused momentarily, peering out from behind the bar or lingering near the kitchen doors. It was as though the whole restaurant had become an audience, eager to witness whatever came next. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Emily let out a shaky breath. She set the tray down on a nearby table, her movements slow and deliberate. "Okay," she said quietly, surprising even herself. "I'll try." The room erupted into murmurs of approval, some patrons nodding encouragingly, while others grinned in anticipation. Elliot sat back in his chair, clearly pleased with himself, as Emily took a tentative step toward the piano. Each step felt heavier than the last, her nerves threatening to overwhelm her. But deep down, buried beneath layers of doubt and fear, a tiny flicker of hope began to stir. What if she could surprise them all, including herself? The room erupted into applause, a wave of sound that seemed to lift Emily out of her seat. Her hands hovered above the keys for a moment longer before she finally lowered them to her lap, her fingers trembling not from nerves this time, but from the sheer intensity of what had just happened. She blinked, her wide eyes scanning the faces around her, as if trying to make sense of their reactions. Some patrons were standing now, clapping enthusiastically, while others sat with expressions of awe etched across their features. Even the waitstaff, who usually remained invisible in the background, had gathered near the kitchen doors, watching with stunned admiration. Elliot was the first to break the spell. He rose slowly from his chair, his earlier smirk replaced by something far more genuine, a look of surprise mixed with respect. For a man known for his bravado and sharp wit, he seemed unusually at a loss for words. Instead of speaking immediately, he simply stared at Emily, his brow furrowed as though trying to reconcile the timid waitress he teased moments ago with a talented musician who had just captivated an entire room. Finally, he approached her, weaving through the tables until he stood directly beside the piano. "That was," he began, pausing to search for the right word. "Incredible. Truly incredible." His voice carried none of its previous mockery. Instead, it held a tone of sincerity that caught Emily off guard. Emily looked up at him, her cheeks flushed from both the performance and the overwhelming reaction it had elicited. I didn't think I could still do that," she admitted softly, her voice barely audible over the lingering applause. "It's been years since I played." Elliot tilted his head, intrigued. "Years? You mean you haven't touched a piano since then?" She shook her head, hesitating before continuing. "Life got complicated. I had to focus on other things. Music wasn't practical anymore." The words came out reluctantly, tinged with sadness. It was clear that letting go of her passion hadn't been easy, even if it had been necessary. Elliot studied her for a moment, his expression thoughtful. Then, gesturing toward the piano, he asked, "Where did you learn to play like that?" That wasn't just talent, it was discipline. Years of practice. Emily hesitated again, unsure how much to share. But there was something about Elliot's demeanor now, earnest, almost kind, that made her feel safe enough to open up. "My mom taught me when I was little," she explained, her gaze drifting to the floor. "She loved music so much, she said it would always be my escape, no matter what happened in life." Her voice softened as memories flooded back. "When I was younger, I dreamed of being the concert pianist. I performed in recitals, won competitions, but after my mom passed away, everything changed. We didn't have much money, and I had to sell my keyboard to help pay for her medical bills. After that, I stopped playing altogether." Her confession hung in the air, heavy with emotion. The room, which had only moments ago buzzed with excitement, grew quiet once more. Patrons exchanged glances, some nodding sympathetically while others whispered words of encouragement. Even Elliot, who thrived on commanding attention, seemed humbled by her story. "You gave up something extraordinary because life demanded it," he said after a pause, his voice quieter now. "But tonight, you reminded everyone, including yourself, what you're capable of." He glanced around the room, taking in the sea of impressed faces. And let me tell you, Emily, talent like yours doesn't belong hidden behind a tray of appetizers." His words struck a chord deep within her. Emily felt a lump rise in her throat, and she quickly looked down to hide the tears welling in her eyes. She wasn't used to being seen this way, not as someone special, not as someone worth noticing. Yet here she was, surrounded by strangers who had witnessed a part of her soul she thought she'd buried long ago. As the applause began to fade, one of the diners, a middle-aged woman sitting near the front, spoke up. "That was absolutely breathtaking," she said warmly, addressing Emily. "You have a gift, dear. Don't ever forget that." Others chimed in, offering similar sentiments, their voices blending together in a chorus of encouragement. For the first time that evening, Emily allowed herself to smile. A small, tentative smile, but one filled with gratitude and hope. Whatever doubts she'd carried with her to the piano bench had begun to dissolve, replaced by a flicker of possibility. Maybe, just maybe, this wasn't the end of her musical journey. Maybe it was the beginning of something new.